Good evening, and welcome again to Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott, and tonight we'll be returning to the subject of the arts in Chicago, a somewhat unusual art, the art of puppeteering. As our guests tonight, we have several of the principals from Opera in Focus, Justin Snyder, Leilani Narciso. So thank you so much for being here. It's a pleasure.
Thanks for having us.
We're delighted to be here.
Well, and having recently been to see your production in Rolling Meadows, I have to say I was really impressed and surprised at the sophistication of the presentation. It's quite a show.
Thank you. We appreciate that. You know, we kind of pride ourselves on defying people's expectations of what puppetry is and what puppets can do. So we're always happy when people come to the theater and are able to experience the art form that we practice.
And I suppose I should have introduced the puppets too
yes.
when I'm introducing the
Don't
puppeteers.
Want to upset them.
Right.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Right.
Here we have Lakme from the classic opera Lakme. Beside her here is Count de Luna from Il Trovatore. Next to him we have Mephistopheles from Gounod's Faust. And over here we have a very, very old ancestor of our puppets. This is an original Kungsohm puppet from the 1940s here. And we kind of brought her along so people could kind of see the evolution of the puppets from how they used to be back then to how what they've turned into today.
Well, so let's, to use a phrase, set the stage for what we're discussing here. And you've mentioned each of these characters as being from an opera, and
yes.
your company, of course, is Opera in Focus.
Correct.
So talk about the connection between opera and puppets.
Okay, the art form itself, the art form that we practice, dates back to actually the late 1930s in Chicago. And there was a fellow named Ernest Wolf who was, as a child, he was taken by his relatives to see the opera Carmen. And he fell in love with the art form. So as a kid, he began building...
With opera, with the actual opera.
With the opera,
live
art
actors.
form of opera, correct. So as a kid, he started building really crude, rudimentary puppets at home. And over the years, they became increasingly more sophisticated. And ultimately, his puppets ended up in what a lot of Chicagoans will remember as the Kungsohm Miniature Grand Opera. And that was a former McCormick mansion that had been turned into this Kungsohm restaurant, which is a Scandinavian restaurant. And the restaurateur, Frederick Kramer, wanted something interesting to put in there to kind of draw people into the restaurant. So when he saw Ernest Wolf's puppets on stage, he said, I have to have that. That'll be the perfect thing. It's so unusual, you know. So he organized a deal with Ernest Wolf to have his puppet opera installed in the Kungsohm restaurant.
And by installed, that's not just show up and work a couple of
yes,
puppets.
it was permanently installed.
Build a stage, lighting,
yes.
everything, right?
He actually invested almost $500,000 into the actual theater itself, and they had very elaborate. It was exactly what you would expect from a real opera house, just kind of in miniature. And the puppets, Ernest Wolf's puppets, were at the Kungsohm from 1941 through 1971.
And is this over here, this is one of the puppets
This is one
from
of the
that
original
era.
Kungsohm puppets here. They've all been retired now. They kind of live in storage in boxes, but
And that's okay with them?
that's okay with her. You know, she put in her time, and she's happy in her retirement now. So, but after the Kungsohm closed in 1971, Bill Foster single-handedly kept the art form alive. Now, Bill started working at Kungsohm in 1943, and at that time he was 14 years old. And over the years, he worked on and off at the Kungsohm in various different capacities. Ultimately, he was the artistic director of the Kungsohm in the 60s. And during his time there, he kind of made a lot of advancements to the puppets, which you can kind of see here. The original Kungsohm puppets, they have a mechanism that's kind of similar to ours. They stand on a circular base, and they have controls for the hands and for the arms and for the heads. They have this interesting head popping mechanism, which our puppets don't have that, but I don't know that they necessarily even need that.
Well, that would only be good for The Exorcist if you were
That's
able to
correct,
put
yes.
that into operatic form, right?
Now, it's interesting because people that used to go to the Kungsohm when they were kids, they think back of the puppets as being these huge, elaborate things. And oftentimes when people come to our shows, they'll say, your puppets are so much smaller than the Kungsohm puppets. But actually,
They're the same size.
the Kungsohm puppets are all between 14 and 15 inches. Our puppets are 16 inches for the adult puppets. So our puppets are actually a little bit taller. The mechanism is a lot more sophisticated on ours, though, and that actually has to do with some of the improvements that Bill Foster made. During the time that the Kungsohm was around, there were actually several different types of puppets that they used. This is the very original form here, which you'll notice she doesn't actually even have any legs. the male puppets would have legs, but they weren't articulated at all.
You
So
couldn't move them at
they
all.
would kind of ice skate on the stage. Whereas you can see from our puppets here, they all have walking mechanisms which enable them to walk. Even the female puppets have legs and walking mechanisms. So over the years, they kind of changed the design of the puppet and modified it as the years went by in order to make them more lifelike and articulated.
So let me segue from that. Leilani, as the stage manager for this opera production, I understand you're the one who cracks the whip and makes everything work behind the scenes. Is that?
Oh,
is that-
somebody has to.
That's true. Someone does have to. So there's a lot of production values that go into these presentations that you make. So with a little bit of the history and looking at how the puppets move, how tough is it to mount an actual production? What goes into all of that?
Oh, it's actually just like any other theatrical production. We need to have our actors, costumes, set pieces, lighting. There's just countless hours of work go into putting these productions together, and it's really no different than any other live production.
Now you make much of your own material, right? So these costumes have all been made by the shop that all of you participate in, right?
Correct.
Yes, yeah, most of our costumes were made by one of the previous puppeteers, Paul Guerra, and he designed and created maybe 80 to 90% of the costumes that we have up until his passing in 2007.
He worked with Bill back at the Kungsholm. Actually, Paul started working there when he was 17. So he had known Bill for many, many years, and when Bill opened Opera in Focus, Paul was his go-to guy for costuming. He was also our principal puppeteer from 1993 till 2006. He was the principal puppeteer of Opera in Focus as well.
So how difficult is it to do all of that? I mean, because even with 90% of the costumes made, you have to repair them, you have to make new costumes. I mean,
Yes.
how tough is that?
We can do simple repairs, but for new productions, and we try to premiere new things every year, naturally we're going to need new costumes. And actually that's the only piece that we go outside to have done. Fortunately, we have friends who
Yes.
are talented enough to do these things for us. But other than that, the sculpting and all of that is made in-house.
And so does that mean that all of you have to become essentially sculptors in order to be able to build these puppets?
My brother Shane is our sculptor, so he has the ability to. I have some sculpting ability, but it's very stylized and very rudimentary. Whereas his talent, he's always had the ability to sculpt very lifelike sculptures. So
He was trained in sculpture? I mean, he has.
yes,
background in
ever
this,
since
right?
he was a kid, that was his interest. And growing up, he took a lot of art classes and studied sculpting and things like that. So when we first started working at the Puppet Opera, Bill Foster noticed his talent and kind of helped foster that and develop his talent on the miniature level of these puppets here. So they all start off as clay sculptures, and he'll sculpt the features in clay, and then it's actually a material called Super Sculpey, which you can then bake, and that hardens. And then from that, he'll make a silicone mold. And then into the silicone mold, he'll pour polyester resin, which is it's an ingredient of fiberglass. And then that's the actual material that we use for most of the puppet parts. Now the hands and the feet, we cast those in lead. And the reason is that they give them more weight. Polyester resin is very, very lightweight, which is good for moving the puppets. But when it comes to making the hands swing naturally when they walk and actually being able to feel what you're doing with the hand, we have to have it a little bit heavier so that we know what's happening. It's interesting that some of our scenes, if there's a lot of set pieces on stage and a lot of puppets on stage, there are situations where you can't actually see what your puppet's doing at all because we're below the stage. So having a little bit of weight in the hands and feet gives us a better idea of what they're actually doing when we're beneath the stage.
Now, and again, that's something I would never think about without hearing
Yes.
about it, that you need some sort of tactile feedback from
Exactly.
these puppets to know what they're doing. Right?
The actual manipulation of them is kind of similar to memorizing a complicated musical piece. You can study the notes and you can practice it, but ultimately when you're on stage performing, you want to have it kind of living inside of you somewhere, so that
you can feel it and really
so that you
express
can
it.
actually do the show and do the performance without actually even having to look at them the whole time. Now we try to watch them when we can, and typically if it's a scene that only has a few puppets on stage, you can get a good vantage point. But you in certain situations where it's really crowded on stage and there's a lot going on, you might be stuck behind your puppet, you might be stuck in a weird angle where you can't really see what's happening. So that's when the actual practicing and having kind of the tactile memory of the scene in your body comes into play and enables you to actually do the scene.
And now, having been to your theater, I think one of the most interesting things, as an aside here, is that you also open up the backstage to people
Yes.
who attend these shows, so they can actually see how these things are done.
Correct.
In fact, I want to thank you, Leilani. You actually gave me a lesson. I would say backstage, but it was really understage. You're
Correct.
beneath the stage, working from these sets of controls. And I have to say, it looked like a challenging thing to do.
It can be, yes.
Yeah, in addition to all those controls, to keep in mind the stage is maybe 5 feet wide, so it's very cramped under there to have 4 people, sometimes 5, to actually put together a successful production.
Because there's plenty of room for 5 14-inch puppets on stage, but there are
Yes.
5 real-size adults
Full-size
underneath,
adults.
right?
Exactly.
How do you orchestrate that? What happens underneath then?
Oh, it's a lot of rehearsal. We need to.
Contortionism.
Right?
Yeah,
Occasional
fortunately, we have
swearing.
really-
Yeah.
Yeah, fortunately, we're not mic'd under the stage. So, but yeah, fortunately, we have wheels on our stools to kind of help us roll around for seamless walking of the puppets on stage.
It's almost 2 separate rehearsals. One is what's happening above the stage and what's happening below the stage, because you really do have to coordinate exactly where all the other puppeteers are and where your stool is going to be in relation to theirs, so that you don't collide or knock somebody off a stool. And
Which I'm sure happens
it has
during
happened.
rehearsal. right?
Unfortunately, it has happened.
Even during
yes.
productions.
During
occasionally?
productions, we've had
Collisions. on stage?
collisions. We've had chairs just break and you'll just fall on the floor. And it's live theater, though. You kind of just have to roll with it and
Or I guess literally roll if you
roll with it.
if
roll
you
with
fall
it.
off your chair.
Yeah.
So how much rehearsal typically goes into a production that you do?
It depends on the complexity of the show. Now, all of our puppeteers have all been there for some years. Now, we have over 115 scenes that we do, and we're always trying to premiere new things. So if it's a scene that we're all very familiar with, that we've all done many times, kind of something like Phantom of the Opera or Hansel and Gretel that we do every year, we can get away with rehearsing a little bit less because we kind of already have an idea of what we're doing. But if it's a premiere or a scene that we haven't done in 10 years or a scene that the newer puppeteers haven't done at all, then we'll have to spend a few more days just working on the mechanics of it. The first stage of it is just memorizing the libretto, the text of the opera, and memorizing the music, which that can take many weeks leading up to the actual physical rehearsal, just playing the music and studying the text. And they're typically we have some English language scenes. We try to include at least one in every show, but most of our scenes are either in Italian or German or French, Russian. So you have to kind of study the original language alongside the English translation in order to get an idea of what's happening, what are the puppets saying, and who are they talking to, and what props are they handling, and what are they doing. It's a lot of information that you have to memorize before you even actually get onto the stage.
In fact, as you speak about this, and I remember we talked about this backstage when I visited your production, that there is so much internalization of all of the different movements. In a sense, it becomes almost more effort than if you yourself were a singer on stage.
Definitely, yeah. Well, I think an actual singer on stage doesn't have to think about how they're going to move their arms or their feet as much. They're kind of focused more on just their vocalizing.
And they would move because they just think, I'm going to move my arm this way, as opposed to being a puppeteer where you have to think, how do I turn this to move
How do I
just
make
so?
the body do what I want it to do? And also, we have a little bit of freedom in that real opera singers, when you watch them on stage, they actually don't move that much. They'll kind of come out and they'll pick a spot and they'll stand there for a while and sing. And the reason is that the more movement you do, the more difficult it is for you to sing. Since these puppets are actually singing along with recordings, they have the ability to move a little bit more when they sing. But a lot of it also, the tricky element that we encounter that the live singers probably don't have to encounter as much is turning off our own personalities. For example, if Renata Tebaldi is going to sing Butterfly, she's performing the role of a female character, Whereas if Leilani here is performing the role of Mephistopheles, she has to completely turn off her feminine instinct and her natural ways and get into the mind of this, demonic entity here. So
The devil.
yeah,
right?
exactly. So
Right.
we have kind of we have to kind of leave our comfort zone a little bit more than a regular just vocalist would have to do in order to make the character that we're portraying.
What I think is so interesting about that is that it is common, sure, in fact, with people who I've tried to describe this to,
Sure.
who think, as you mentioned, about puppets being, well, you put your hand in the sock puppet and you make
Yeah.
movements. And this is something entirely different. This is the equivalent of a stage production, as Leilani, as you said, not just in the sense of the operation of it and building the stage and blocking the scenes, etc., but in terms of learning the role and internalizing the role as any actor on stage would have to do. Is
Yes.
that right?
Exactly.
We're one of the most technically sophisticated puppet theaters in the world. So the puppets themselves and the costuming is really only one small component of all the various different things that we have to think about when we're doing a show. And in fact, when I was fresh out of high school when I went there to apply for a job, and I told them I want to be a puppeteer, and they kind of laughed at me. And they were basically trying to say that nobody that works here is just a puppeteer. If you're going to work here, you're going to have to learn every aspect of this. And it's interesting because a lot of times that's partially why we offer the backstage tours. You would be surprised by how often people think that they're automatons, that we just push a button and then we sit back and relax and the show does itself. But really, in fact, everything at our theater is manual. Nothing is automated. So even little things, if you see a light coming up or a curtain opening, there's always a human being there moving a dimmer or pulling a string. And so when it comes to actual rehearsing, the actual stage dynamics is one element, but we also have to focus on everything else that's happening off the stage and all the technical things, all the lighting, all the
And that's where
sound
you
components.
come in, Leilani, right, as the stage manager?
That's where she
That's
comes
right.
in, yes.
Right. So you make sure everything works, the curtain goes up on time?
She does.
So where did you learn your stage management craft? I mean, because this is the same as any full-size theater, right?
It is, and the guys have been very gracious. It has been on-the-job training. They helped me, learn how to become a puppeteer, and in knowing what the puppeteers actually have to do, then you know what sort of backstage things need to happen, and it's really just making mental notes and actual physical written notes of all the little details that go into each of the productions.
So how do you manage both? You're under the stage controlling a puppet, and you're the stage manager making it all work. Doesn't that seem like a lot to do?
Well, I'm not the only one who is doing a lot.
A lot of barking orders. And, we try to, typically during the rehearsal, we try to work out any kind of weird little kinks that might occur. So usually the shows themselves actually go rather seamlessly. There's usually very little communication between the puppeteers. Sometimes if something starts to go wrong, we can kind of communicate with weird eye symbols and sign language. But
It's one of the benefits of working together for how many years.
yeah.
And
You just kind of know.
how many years, in fact, have the two of you been working on this?
I'm one of the newer ones, but I've been with the theater for 3 years.
I've been there, I think 2012 will be 12 years. So
Yeah, you're a veteran. Right?
And we all, I should point out, it's kind of a trial by fire for us all when we start off there in terms of learning these things. I think less than a week after I first went there, they had me on stage doing a role, and it was terrible. I did a terrible job, and unfortunately there are videotapes, so I'm constantly reminded of my terrible debut. And
I keep thinking, I have to stop for a moment, because the way you talk about this I love is you talk about your first experience on stage.
yes.
Right? It's just the way an actor would approach
Yes.
it. You're on stage. It's not the puppet on stage. You're on stage.
Yes,
right?
I think puppeteers, we're kind of introverted extroverts. Like, we like the idea of performing and being a performer, but we're very shy people. Like, I could never put makeup on in a costume and go on stage and do these types of things. But when I'm living through this inanimate object, then I have the freedom to be more open and extroverted about it. So.
Something your brother said to me when we were at your theater, I asked him about, I made some sort of comment about, well, you mastered puppetry, and he said, oh, no, I don't think that you ever master it. Like music, you can always get better.
I agree with that.
But you never really become a master, right?
Yeah.
So I say that because I'd actually like to ask you to do a few movements with one of the puppets, because I was so impressed at the way they move. And just a minute ago, when you were moving the hands,
well, they're called rod puppets, and this is the crucial rod here that controls the hand here. It's spring steel, and they're attached to the hand. So when we actually move this rod, we control the arm. So the arm, we can make the arm go up. We can cause the hand to move inward or outward. And that's basically, through both of these rods here, is how we control the functioning of the puppet's hands.
So that in particular, I found so remarkable when I saw the show, that as they sing, the hands move the way you would
Yes.
expect a human singer on stage to move.
And that's one of the many things that separates this type of puppet from other puppets. You know, marionette puppets are very common. There are other puppet troupes that will perform operatic scenes with marionettes. But
And marionettes being you control them from the
control them
top,
from
right,
above with strings, yes. And you know, there are some really, really amazing marionette puppets out there. But there are certain things that they have inherently more difficulty doing than these puppets. Handling of props. This type of hand mechanism here makes it very easy for the puppets to pick up props and to handle them, candles and weaponry of various different sort. And so that's one thing. Also, the fact that they're operated from below and we don't have all the strings from above, that gives them a lot easier time walking through doorways and doing certain types of activities like that. But the hands themselves on these puppets is one of the most important functions. That's actually kind of how you sell the singing, because of the fact that the mouths don't actually move. So through the head movements here, we can simulate the idea that she's singing, but really the hands also kind of sell it. So if you have many male puppets and many female puppets on stage, the audience needs to know which one is singing, you know. And actually through the head and hand movements there, that's how we're able to point out that this is the puppet that's singing, you know.
In fact, you mentioned that the mouths don't actually move, but when we were backstage, one of the people who was in the audience
Was arguing about it, yes.
Yes, said, but I saw the mouth move.
They say that, you know, they say, I saw the puppet's teeth, I saw them moving the mouth, and that's actually a very good compliment to us, because that means that we're really kind of selling the illusion of the puppet actually singing. But it's all really through the head movement. You know, we have an up and down mechanism that controls the up and down movement of the head, and then we have a side to side, and those mechanisms there basically control the singing effect. Then we also have the back string here, which enables them to go back for high notes if they're singing a high note. And then, of course, the legendary walking mechanism that enables them to walk. And she actually does, in fact, have legs. You can't really see them because of this costume, but she does, in fact, have legs.
She doesn't mind you showing off her legs.
She's, you know, she's very open about that.
Right. One of the other things that I am impressed about is the fact that this is an art form that was handed down almost from one generation to the next to you and your current crew. It's something we don't see much of in modern life, where a troupe of artists or a great craftsman, for example, would hand off a shop to a young apprentice.
Yes.
But that seems to be the tradition here in puppetry.
And it is, in fact, it's that sort of apprenticeship is kind of a dying thing, I think. Nowadays, everything's gotten so technical, and you know, when people try to learn a craft, it can become very technical, whereas for us, it was more, from the minute that we met Bill and Paul and Will Harder, the puppeteers that were there when we started, they were like family to us. So we would, even when we weren't performing with puppets, we'd be at Bill's house, you know, building puppets and set pieces. We spent holidays with them. So right off the bat, they kind of became like our second family. And I think that's how it kind of progresses, that when you're working in such a peculiar field as this, and as Bill was getting older, he knew that he kind of needed to find a way to keep the art form going. So when he met us, I think he was kind of happy to find other weird people that he could sort of, you know,
Who were equally taken by
equally
this art
taken
form.
by it. Yeah, it's something that when you encounter it, you know, it becomes a labor of love right off the bat. So.
And do you feel then that at some point, you guys are both young, but at some point you're going to need to look for the next generation to come
Definitely,
up and hand off to?
I've already been trying to pass it more on to her, even though actually she's, you know, we're kind of comparable in age, but definitely it's you know, Bill Foster, his biggest fear was that they would end up in some stuffy museum somewhere.
Not being used.
Yes, he felt as though it's kind of like a musical instrument, you know, it's built to perform. And the minute that you just have it like hung up on a wall doing nothing, it's kind of not fulfilling its purpose in life. So that's a very important thing for us. As I move ahead. You know, we're actually always open to finding new puppeteers, and when young people come that are interested, we invite them under the stage to try the puppets out, and we kind of watch them to see who's got some abilities, so that
And that's
we
one of
can,
the benefits of having the backstage tour after
Yes.
each of the performances.
I guess I didn't pass that test, right? You didn't recruit me
you know,
afterward.
you got some skills.
We're keeping you.
Yeah, keeping me in the
Yeah.
background. in the back of the mind,
Absolutely,
yeah, yeah.
yes.
You're on the short list.
Yeah, there you go. As you do this art form, though, we discovered it because a friend of ours did research, was actually looking for
Wow.
whatever happened to the Kungsholm
Yes,
puppets,
sure.
and came upon your theater. So how do you work to promote it, and how do you get the message out? Not just that you're there, but what it really is. You know, as I found when I went there, it completely defied my expectations.
Sure. There's a lot of what I would call guerrilla advertising. We print up flyers and stickers and posters, and there are lots of different places around the Chicagoland area that will let us put up a flyer or a poster and things like that. We have a very, very small budget to begin with, and what little budget we do have is usually put towards maintenance and the building of things. So we don't really, when it comes to advertising, there's not really any budget whatsoever. So we try to get away with the free forms of advertising as much as we can. Now, there are a few other avenues. Just, occasionally we'll be fortunate enough to be featured on a television show like this or a radio program. Things like that kind of help spike the attendance. But usually our actual main method of getting the word out is just word of mouth, is hoping people that do come to the show will enjoy it enough to tell their friends and families.
Which we have, by the way.
Oh, we appreciate
Told
that.
many of our friends about this. I will tell you, though, it is a difficult message, because when
Yes.
you say, "Oh, go see the puppet opera," people kind of look at you cross-eyed and say, "Well, I don't like opera and I don't like puppets. Why
Yes.
would I go do that?" And the answer, in my case, is that because it so defies your expectations,
Yes.
you need to go see this to understand it for real.
I'll tell you, actually, my own mother, growing up, she hated opera. A lot of people are like that, they who haven't been exposed to the art form. So when she heard that I was working there, she's like, oh gosh. But
My son is lost to me.
yes, but then when she came and saw the show, she was completely mesmerized. And I think that even people that don't enjoy opera as an art form, they will enjoy the show in spite of that fact, just for the stagecraft of it. And similar thing with puppets is a lot of people say I'm not a fan of puppet shows because they think we are doing this, goofy thing. But when they actually see our scenery and our puppets, and they see everything, the action being played out on stage, then they kind of look past all their preconceived notions, and they're like, wow, this is completely something amazing that I didn't expect it would be,
Well, that was certainly my reaction. And believe it or not, we're already out of time. So would you
Wow.
like to have one of your puppets wave goodnight?
All right, Lock May, give them a nice little wave goodbye. Come
There we
visit us
go.
at the theater.
Okay. Well, Justin Leilani, thank you so much for coming here, and I wish you the best of luck, and we'll be back to see you soon.
All right.
Great, thank you.
Thank you for having us.
And thank you for joining us once again on Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott.